live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek.
In this video, we're going to talk about the Menagerie, parts 1 and 2. I'm covering both parts of the Menagerie in one video, in part because there's just not that much really to say about the Menagerie that hasn't already been covered in my video about The Cage, the original unaired pilot of the show. And you'll see a link to that in the top corner, and there's one down in the description. Basically, the executives at NBC didn't want to air the original series pilot. But Gene Roddenberry really wanted it on the air. It did actually air in 1988, some 20 years after the show was off the air. But Gene Roddenberry didn't want to wait until then. So he found a workaround, which was to create the Menagerie, a two-part episode that's basically just a frame narrative stuck around the events of The Cage. So essentially, what happens in this episode is that Captain Pike, the former commander of the Enterprise, and the star of The Cage, has been severely damaged in a space accident. And he's, like, completely paralyzed. He's in a sort of mechanized wheelchair. He can move around a little bit, and he has a light that he can blink once for yes and twice for no. So he's jacked up. Spock essentially commandeers the Enterprise and kidnaps Captain Pike to take him to Talos 4, which is where the events of The Cage took place. This is the one forbidden world that no Federation ship or personnel is allowed to visit, under penalty of death. And so Spock is not only going to the one forbidden world, he's not only stolen the Enterprise, he has also kidnapped Captain Pike. So things are not looking fantastic for Spock. And so when Captain Kirk and Admiral Mendez from, I forget which starbase. I want to say Starbase 11, but I think that's wrong, and it doesn't really matter. But Kirk and Mendez catch up to the Enterprise in a shuttlecraft in the sense that they take off trying to pursue it, knowing they can't catch it. And when they are out of fuel and going to coast to their slow, grisly deaths, Spock uses the tractor beam and then beams them on board, knowing that they will have to arrest him. At which point, a trial begins to determine whether or not Spock is guilty. As evidence, Spock basically offers a transmission from the Talosians that shows us the events of the cage. So they project to the Enterprise the events of 13 years before, when Pike, Spock, and the rest of the old Enterprise crew had visited Talos 4. This goes on, We get these sort of periodic, generally not that useful interruptions for mostly Mendez and sometimes Kirk to be like, this is crazy. I don't even know if we can accept this kind of evidence. Captain Pike, are these really the events of 13 years ago? They don't really do that many hand gestures, but I'm signaling their confusion. So we get those kinds of interruptions, and there's really not that much else to it. At the end of the second episode, it's revealed that Admiral Mendez was never there at all. Ooh, it was just an illusion from the Talosians. But Mendez was back at the starbase, and he was getting the same transmissions, telling the same story of the cage that Kirk and Spock and Pike were seeing on the Enterprise. Despite the fact that this is the one forbidden world that no one can visit under pain of death, Starfleet's basically just like, meh, fuck it, we don't even care. Take Pike to Talos 4, Spock, no consequences for you for literally going to the one forbidden planet, incurring the death penalty, kidnapping Pike, and stealing the Enterprise. They're just like, whatevs. It's not a problem, even though you've broken all these massive laws. So it's a happy ending in that sense. And the upshot is that in the original episode, The Cage, the original pilot, what happens at the end is Vera, who's the girl on Talos 4, she survived the original spaceship crash. The Talosians sort of kind of put her back together with like duct tape and safety pins and stuff. And so she's now kind of horribly disfigured. The Talosians give her back the illusion of beauty, and they give her an imaginary Captain Pike to hang out with her and be her boyfriend / slave companion, whatever it is. So, the upshot of this, the reason that Spock has kidnapped Pike and is attempting to take him to Talos 4 is because the Talosians can his mind still works, so that's important. His body doesn't work. The Talosians can give him the experience of having a physical body. And so the Menagerie repurposes that closing scene from The Cage, where Vera has a fake Pike to hang out with her, that this now becomes the real Captain Pike, who, through the Talosians' mental abilities, telekinetic abilities, or whatever it is now sort of back in his body of 13 years before. So it becomes a sort of happy ending. Spock gets away with all of his crimes, and Captain Pike is not condemned to live in his crippled body forever. Vera gets to be beautiful. They get to, do zoo slave stuff, whatever. And everybody wins. So, there's some big social justice things raised by this episode. And again, I'm focusing primarily on the frame element of the Menagerie. I'm not as interested in The Cage. Again, I talked about that in the previous video. To me, the biggest element here, in terms of social justice, is actually the question of euthanasia. Because so very specifically, that is not what we get in this episode. We do not get Captain Pike being killed as a sort of alternative to suffering and eventually dying from that suffering. That's not what we have here. But we have something that kind of closely resembles euthanasia in the broad strokes, in that someone has violated a number of laws and a number of ethical codes, because Pike doesn't want to go with Spock. Pike is resistant to going as much as he's able to resist in his condition. So, though ultimately when the Telosians are like, we can give you your body back, he's like, yes, I would like that. So, we have someone who is clearly violating the law here in order to take someone out of pain. And while this isn't death for Pike, this is a better life, at least arguably so. I think most people would say it's a better life. The basic principle remains fundamentally the same with debates over euthanasia. Is it ethical to relieve someone's pain by committing a potentially illegal or unethical act? And I think the show, because it has that happy ending where Spock's crimes are not treated as crimes, where Pike is rewarded really by getting his body of 13 years before back, etc., etc. Vera gets the man of her dreams, etc. Everybody wins, basically. In that sense, there is a kind of endorsement of the idea of euthanasia, the idea that in order to prevent suffering or minimize suffering, it's okay and sometimes even the right thing to commit an illegal or potentially unethical act. So I think that's the biggest social justice element that we have here. But I think the other one that's really worth talking about is the question of loyalty. Spock's loyalties are divided in the Menagerie in a way that we really almost never see again. I guess there's a couple of episodes, particularly when the issue of his duty as a Vulcan versus his duty as a Starfleet officer comes up. But really, even then, it's something of a different kind of tension, because Spock always chooses his duty as a Starfleet officer because he thinks that's the proper Vulcan thing to do. Anyway, that's other episodes. In this episode, his loyalties are divided between Captain Pike, his former captain who he served with for a long time, versus Captain Kirk, his current captain who he's friends with. In order to do the right thing for Captain Pike, Spock has to betray Kirk. But he's also, in a way, unwilling to betray Kirk, which is why when the shuttlecraft starts running out of fuel, Spock essentially goes back and gets Kirk and Mendez, who's not really there, but the image of Mendez, I guess, knowing that they will put him on trial and find him guilty for the crimes that he has committed. And knowing that, all things being equal, if Spock hadn't jerry-rigged the computers so that nobody could override the course to Talos 4, that Mendez and Kirk would take Pike back to the starbase. So we have that issue of divided loyalties and what it means to have those kinds of personal or professional loyalties and how they may conflict is a really central issue here. And Spock tries to walk a line, I think, between loyalty to Captain Pike and trying to do what's best for Captain Pike versus loyalty to Captain Kirk and trying to minimize any damage to Kirk's reputation and any fallout that might affect